Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. And before we dive into the story, my mom said we can't get to 1,000 subscribers. Can you help me prove her wrong? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and be part of this journey. Let's show her what we can do. Now, let's dive into the story. The river didn't care about Clara Winslow. That was the first thing she understood when she saw it. Swollen and roaring, the color of old rust and broken earth. Moving so fast, it bent the trees on its banks backward like frightened men bowing to a king. She had been standing on its edge for 2 days. 2 days of watching the water rise. 2 days of telling herself it would slow down, calm down, go back to what it was when she crossed this same trail 6 months ago on her way west. But the river had no memory of mercy. It just kept coming. Her wagon sat lopsided in the mud 30 yards behind her. One rear wheel cracked clean off when the road gave way the night the storm hit. Everything she owned, her mother's quilt, her father's pocket watch, 3 jars of salted pork, a satchel of letters, was inside that wagon. She hadn't touched the food since yesterday morning. Her mouth tasted like dust and worry. She was 26 years old, and she had never felt so completely, brutally alone. The storm had come from nowhere, the way storms always did out here. One minute the sky was pale and dry. The next it was a dark wall rolling in from the north, like God had decided to rearrange the land. The creek she'd been following, barely knee-deep when she arrived, had swallowed its own banks and become something else entirely. Something with teeth. She'd tried to move the wagon herself. She'd tried twice, putting her whole body into it, slipping in the mud until her dress was ruined and her hands were bleeding. Nothing moved. The horse, old Clem, faithful and patient for 11 years, had snapped his rope in the night and disappeared into the dark. She hadn't heard him since. Just the water. Always just the water. Clara had sat inside the wagon on the first night and prayed out loud, the way her grandmother used to, hands pressed flat on her knees, voice steady even while her heart was hammering. She prayed for rescue. She prayed for the creek to stop. She even prayed for Clem to come back. None of it worked. By the second evening, she stopped praying and started planning. Plans were harder to make when you had no horse, no road, and a river between you and everything else. She was burning the last of her small fire when she saw the figure on the far bank. He appeared the way shadows appear at dusk. 1 second he wasn't there, the next he was. Standing absolutely still at the water's edge, tall and dark, against the pale evening sky. She shot to her feet, waved both arms. The figure didn't move. She grabbed the edge of her skirt and waved that too, screaming over the roar of the water until her voice cracked. Still nothing. Just that stillness. She squinted across the water, maybe 70 yards, maybe 80, and tried to make out his face. She couldn't. She could only see the outline of a man, broad-shouldered, with what looked like a rifle resting loose in one hand. For a long, terrible moment, she thought he wasn't real. That loneliness had finally cracked something inside her, and she was seeing things. Then the figure moved, slowly, deliberately. He set the rifle against a rock, reached up and removed something from around his neck, a cord, a pouch, something small, and tucked it carefully into a coat pocket. Then he folded the coat itself and set it on top of the rifle. All of this was unhurried, calm, like a man setting the table before supper. She didn't understand what he was doing. Not at first. She thought he was settling in for the night, making camp on the far bank, maybe planning to shout across to her in the morning. She started to wave again, more desperately, with both arms, with everything she had. And then he stepped into the water. Not carefully, not testing it. He walked into that river like he had somewhere to be. The current hit him immediately. She could see it from where she stood, the way the water buckled and shoved, the way white foam exploded around his legs. He didn't stop, didn't flinch. He moved at an angle, leaning into the current, using his body the way a boat uses a rudder, not fighting the river, but directing himself through it. The water rose to his thighs, then his waist, then his chest. He was still moving, still steady. Clara stood at the edge of her own bank, with her hands over her mouth, and could not look away. She had seen men do brave things in her life. She had never seen anything like this. He was more than halfway across now, and the worst current was right there, right in the middle, where the water moved the fastest and the deepest. She saw him stagger once, just once. His arms came up for balance, and his head went low, and for one long, horrible second, she thought he was going under. He didn't go under. He caught himself, reset his footing, and kept coming. Kept his eyes forward. Kept his eyes, she realized with a start that made her breath catch. On her. Not on the water, not on the rocks, on her. He was almost to her side now, the water down to his thighs again, and she could finally see his face. Weathered, sun-dark, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from mountain rock, and eyes, pale eyes, the kind that caught light from nowhere, that were completely, totally calm. No fear, not an ounce of it. He stepped out of the water and stood in front of her, dripping, breathing hard, chest heaving, and said nothing. Just looked at her. She opened her mouth to speak, and he shook his head once, not yet, and turned back to the river. She watched him study it. He stood there for almost a full minute, reading the current the way other men read newspapers. Then he turned back to her. His voice, when it came, was low and unhurried. "Don't look at the water when we cross," he said. "Look at me. Only me." She nodded. They stepped in together. She looked at the water, and in that single moment, in what she saw reflected in those churning brown depths, she understood exactly who this man was and what he carried. And it broke her heart before he even told her his name. His name was Eli Voss. He told her on the far bank, after they crossed, after she'd stopped shaking, and he'd started a fire using nothing but flint and dry bark. He pulled from the inside of a rotted log. He said his name the way people say things they've stopped being surprised by. Flat and plain, without ceremony. Eli Voss. She repeated it back to him. He nodded once, like she'd gotten it right, and went back to feeding the fire. She sat across from him, wrapped in a blanket he'd handed her without a word, watching the flames catch, watching him move around the camp with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years living alone and learning to need almost nothing. He wasn't young. Somewhere in his middle 30s, she guessed. His hair was dark with threads of early gray at the temples. His hands, she noticed his hands, were large and scarred, the knuckles thick, the fingers steady. These were hands that had worked hard for a long time. They did not shake, not even a little, not even after he'd just crossed a river that would have drowned most men. She asked him where he'd come from. He pointed north, toward the mountain range that sat behind them, like a wall of dark stone against the sky. Said he had a cabin up there, had been living in it for 2 winters. She asked if he was a trapper. He said sometimes. She asked if he was a rancher. He said not anymore. She asked if he was passing through. He looked at the fire for a while before answering. "I was hunting," he said. Storm pushed the elk down off the ridge. I followed them to the valley. He paused. Saw your fire last night. Too small for a camp. Too steady for an accident. She stared at him. He'd seen her fire the night before, from the other side of that river, and he'd waited. She felt a sharp thread of anger twist through her relief. You waited a whole day? She said. He looked at her with those pale eyes. River was higher last night, he said simply. Would have taken us both. There was no apology in it, no defensiveness. Just the fact laid out flat. She wanted to argue with it and found she couldn't. Because he was right. She'd watched the water herself. Last night it had been worse. He had coffee. Black, bitter, and the best thing she had ever tasted. She held the tin cup in both hands and drank it slowly while he rebuilt her fire into something that would last the night. He worked without being asked. This was another thing she noticed about him. He didn't ask permission before helping, and he didn't explain himself while he did it. He just moved through problems the way he'd moved through that river. Direct, efficient, with a strange, quiet grace. She told him her situation, the wagon, the broken wheel, the horse, the letters in the satchel. She was heading to a town called Dellridge, in the valley southwest of here, to a man named Gerald Fenn, who she had agreed to marry. She said all of this without embarrassment, though she felt some. It was a peculiar thing to explain to a stranger, that you were traveling alone through wild country to marry a man you'd never met face to face. Eli listened to all of it without changing expression. When she finished, he asked one question. Did you choose him, or did someone choose him for you? It was such an unexpected question that she laughed, a short, surprised sound. I chose him, she said. He nodded slowly, like this mattered. She slept that night better than she'd slept in a week. She wasn't sure why. The situation hadn't changed. She was still stranded, still horseless, still days from Dellridge. But the fire was warm, and the coffee was real. And somewhere across the camp a man was sleeping who had walked into a killing river for a woman he didn't know. She lay on her side looking at the stars through the canopy of pine, and tried to understand that. Tried to find the logic in it. Back in Millhaven, the town she'd grown up in, the men she'd known were not like this. They were not bad men, most of them. But they were calculating men. They weighed cost before they moved. They measured what they'd get before they gave. Eli Voss had looked across 70 yards of raging water at a woman waving her arms and had simply gone. No negotiation. No hesitation. She thought about the moment she'd looked at the water during the crossing. Just for a second. Just a glance down at the dark, churning surface. And in it, she had seen, or thought she had seen, a reflection that wasn't quite right. A reflection that told her something about this man that no introduction ever could. She filed it away. She would ask him about it. But not yet. Morning came cold and clear, the way mountain mornings always did after a big storm, like the world had been scrubbed clean and left out to dry. Eli was already up when she opened her eyes, crouched at the river's edge, studying the water level. She walked over and stood beside him. The river was lower, not safe, but lower. He turned and looked at her and said, 2 more days and we can cross back to your wagon. She nodded. 2 days. She looked at him sideways. His profile against the morning light was something out of a painting she'd once seen in a church back east. All hard lines and stillness, like something made for endurance rather than comfort. She asked him without thinking, "What happened to you?" He didn't answer right away. He picked up a stone from the riverbank and turned it over in his fingers. Looked at it the way you look at something you've looked at 1,000 times before. Then he set it back down, exactly where he'd found it. "That's a long story," he said. "We've got 2 days," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. It was the first time she'd seen his face come close to it. "Then we'd better start walking," he said, and stood up. And without another word, he led her up the trail toward the high trees, and she followed. And something that had been frozen inside her chest for a very long time began, quietly, carefully, to thaw. They walked through the morning with the river noise fading behind them and the pine forest closing in on both sides like a slow green embrace. Eli moved through the trees like he'd memorized them, ducking a branch here, stepping over a root there, never looking down, never hesitating. Clara followed a few steps behind, watching, his back, learning the rhythm of how he moved through the world. He didn't talk much. She'd already figured that out. But the silence he carried wasn't unfriendly. It was the silence of someone who had stopped filling empty air with noise because he'd spent enough time alone to realize most noise wasn't necessary. She could respect that. She was a talker herself, had been her whole life. But even she felt the peace of this particular quiet. The mountains smelled like cold pine and wet earth and something sweeter underneath, like the land itself was exhaling. Birds she didn't recognize called from somewhere above them. A deer watched them from 30 feet away and didn't move, just stood and looked, as still as a painting. He'd had a wife. Her name was Nora. He told Clara this an hour into the walk, without her asking, as if he'd been turning the decision over in his mind since morning, and finally decided the weight of carrying it was heavier than the weight of speaking it. Nora had been a school teacher, from a town in Missouri. They'd met on the trail west when her wagon had a cracked axle and he'd fixed it without being asked. Clara almost laughed at that. Almost. She swallowed it. Nora was bright, he said. Brighter than him. Funnier, too. She had a way of making a room feel larger just by walking into it. They'd settled at the base of the mountain range, started a small cattle operation, built a house with their own hands over the course of a summer. He said, "We built it the way people say things that are both ordinary and sacred, like breathing, like prayer." They had a daughter. Her name was Wren, 5 years old, blonde, loud. She liked to chase the chickens and name every single one of them, and then cry when they were cooked for supper. The fever had come in the second winter. It moved through the valley like a rumor at first. One family sick, then 2, then the whole lower road. By the time it reached their house, he'd already been trying to get medicine from the nearest town, 3 days' ride east. He made the ride in 2, pushed the horse near to death, came back with a doctor's bag of remedies and hope banging against his ribs. He was too late for Wren. She went first, in the night, quiet and fast. "The way small things leave," he said, without enough warning. Nora lasted 2 more weeks. She spent most of them lucid, sitting up in bed, making him describe the outside world to her because she was too weak to go see it herself. "What does the mountain look like today? Is there snow on the north face yet? Did the creek freeze?" He described everything. He left nothing out. He gave her the whole world in words because it was the only thing he had left to give. She died on a Tuesday, just before dawn, with her hand in his and the first gray light coming through the window. He buried them both on the hill behind the house. Then he locked the door and walked into the mountains and didn't come back down for 6 months. Clara walked beside him and said nothing. Not because she couldn't find words. She always found words. but because some stories don't need a response. They just need to be received. She received it. She felt the weight of it settle somewhere in her chest and stay there. She didn't tell him she was sorry. She didn't tell him she understood. She just walked beside him in the high quiet of the morning and let the story be what it was. Enormous and finished and his. After a while, he glanced at her sideways, as if checking whether she was still there. She was. He looked back at the trail. The silence between them felt different now. Not empty, not polite. It was the silence of two people who have crossed from small talk into something real, and are both still deciding what to do with it. They stopped at midday beside a stream that ran clear and fast over flat gray stones. He pulled food from his pack, dried venison, hard biscuit, dried berries that tasted like concentrated sweetness, and divided it without ceremony. She ate and watched the water. He sat across the stream on a flat boulder, eating slowly, looking at nothing in particular. She thought about Gerald Fenn, about the letters he'd written her. Careful, thoughtful letters, full of descriptions of the land and the weather and the small daily facts of his life. He was a good writer, precise. She'd been impressed by his precision. But reading those letters now, in her memory, sitting beside this mountain stream across from this man who had crossed a river with nothing but his own body and will, she noticed for the first time how much those letters had described the world, and how little they had described Gerald Fenn himself. What he feared, what he loved, what he'd lost, what made him get up in the morning when getting up was hard. She hadn't thought to ask. She hadn't known those were the questions that mattered. She was starting to understand that they were. On the afternoon of the first day, Eli showed her something she wasn't expecting. They had climbed to a ridge that looked out over the valley below. The swollen river, a brown ribbon in the distance, her broken wagon, a small dark shape on the near bank. And he had stopped, not to rest, but to look. Just to look. She stood beside him and looked too. The valley was immense. Tawny grass and dark green pine and the silver flash of water everywhere. The whole thing cupped between mountain walls under a sky so blue it almost hurt. She had grown up in a flat, dusty town. She had never seen country like this. She said so. He glanced at her. Then he said something that surprised her. It looked like this the first time I saw it too, like it was showing off. There it was again, that almost smile. This time it made it the whole way. Brief, like lightning, but real. She stored it like currency. That evening, while she was helping gather wood for the night's fire, she found the photograph. It was tucked into the outer pocket of his pack, the pocket that had come loose, the flap hanging open. She didn't mean to see it, but she did. A small photograph, the edges worn soft from handling, the image faded but clear enough. A woman with clever eyes and a wide smile. And beside her, barely reaching her hip, a little girl with both arms raised like she was about to fly somewhere. Clara stood there holding the photograph for only a second before putting it back exactly as she'd found it. She said nothing. He was across the camp splitting wood and didn't see her. But she carried the image with her for the rest of the evening like something fragile she'd been accidentally handed and didn't quite know how to return. After supper, she asked him how he'd learned to cross rivers like that. He looked at the fire, said he'd been an Army scout for 7 years before he settled here. Said you learned water the same way you learned everything out here, by paying attention or by drowning. He said it matter-of-factly, but she heard the thing underneath it. 7 years of paying attention. 7 years of reading dangerous things and moving through them. She asked if he'd ever been afraid of the water. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I've been afraid of it every time." She stared at him. "But you didn't look afraid," she said. He poked the fire with a stick, sending a small shower of sparks upward into the dark. "Fear and action aren't the same thing," he said. "You can be afraid and still go." She thought about that for a long time after he'd gone quiet again. She thought it might be the most useful thing anyone had ever said to her. The second day was easier. The trail widened and the going was flatter, and Eli seemed not exactly relaxed. He didn't have the type of body that relaxed, but more open. He asked her questions, real ones, about Millhaven, about her family, her father, a blacksmith, who'd died of a bad lung 3 years ago, her mother, who'd remarried a decent man and moved north, about her own skills, which turned out to be considerable. She could sew a wound shut, preserve most anything edible, navigate by stars, and do figures in her head faster than most men could on paper. He listened to all of this with the same focused attention he gave to rivers and ridgelines, like she was information he intended to use. It was, she thought, one of the more unusual ways anyone had ever made her feel interesting. On the afternoon of the second day, they came back down to the river and found it as he'd predicted, lower, slower, crossable. He scouted it carefully, walking the bank in both directions before choosing a spot. Then he turned to her. The same instruction as before, delivered the same way, low, certain, without drama. "Don't look at the water. Look at me." She held his gaze. Pale eyes and a weathered face, standing at the edge of a river that had already tried to kill her once. She nodded. They stepped in. This time the current pushed, but didn't grab. This time the water was cold, but not violent. And this time she kept her eyes on his face the entire way across. Watched those calm eyes watch her back. Watched the water register nothing in them except a problem to be solved. They came out on her side of the bank, wet to the waist and standing. Her wagon was right there. Her satchel, her mother's quilt, her letters, all of it exactly where she'd left it. She turned to him. He was already looking upriver, calculating something. She said his name. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. She meant it to cover the river, but she knew it covered more than that. He fixed the wagon wheel in 3 hours. She didn't ask him to. She was inside the wagon checking her provisions when she heard the sound. Methodical, focused, the sound of a man working, and came out to find him underneath the wagon with her spare wheel that she'd forgotten she had, doing something with the axle using 2 tools he'd produced from his own pack. She stood there for a moment watching him work. There was something almost unbearable about it. Not the work itself, but the fact of it. This man, who owed her nothing, who had already crossed a river twice, was now lying on his back in the mud, fixing her broken wagon without a word of discussion. She had spent most of her adult life in the company of men who announced their help before they gave it, who made sure you knew the scale of what they were doing, who required gratitude in advance. Eli Voss fixed the wheel, and when he was done, he stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at it the way a man looks at a completed thing, checking it, not admiring it. Then he said, "Should hold. Go easy on the road until the valley." They had supper that night beside the repaired wagon. She cooked the salted pork from her jar, softened hard biscuit, the last of his dried berries mixed in for sweetness. He watched her cook with the same attention he gave everything. She was aware of being watched and found she didn't mind. She minded when men watched her with wanting in it. This was different. This was the way you watch someone who is doing something you respect. She asked him, while the pork was sizzling, what he planned to do after Dellridge. He was quiet for a moment. Said he'd go back up the mountain, back to the cabin. She asked if he didn't get lonely. He said he'd thought about that. Said loneliness and solitude weren't always the same thing. Said some people were more alone in a crowded room than they ever were on a mountain by themselves. She thought about Millhaven, about Sunday suppers with half the town crammed into the church hall, and the noise and the laughter and the particular emptiness she had always felt right in the middle of it. "I know what you mean," she said quietly. The fire burned low, and neither of them moved to add wood. The sky above the valley was enormous and full of stars, so many that they seemed like something spilled, like someone had tipped a jar of light and let it run across the dark. She asked him about the cord he'd removed before crossing the river, the one he'd tucked so carefully into his pocket. He reached into his shirt and pulled it out now. A simple leather cord with a small carved piece of bone hanging from it. A bird. Tiny. Simple. The kind of thing a child might make and a parent would keep forever. "Wren carved it," he said. "She was 5. He held it up for a moment so she could see it. Then he tucked it back. She didn't say anything. He didn't need her to. She thought about the water again, about what she'd seen in it during the first crossing. She had never told him what she'd seen, what had felt like vision, but was probably just the water moving in a certain way, playing tricks on a frightened woman's eyes. She had seen, or thought she had seen, 2 small shapes in the reflection beside his. One tall, one small, walking beside him through the water, like they were still with him, like he was never actually alone, no matter how far from that hillside grave he walked. She knew it was the water. She knew it was her own fear making shapes out of chaos. But she also knew why she had understood him in that moment. Because a man who carries the dead that way, with that kind of devotion, was not capable of abandonment, was not capable of turning away from a woman waving on a bank. It wasn't bravery that had sent him into the river. It was love. Old love, carrying weight, still walking. That night she lay awake for a long time listening to the creek and thinking about Gerald Fenn. She thought about the way his letters had described his ranch, the good grass, the strong fence posts, the reliable well, all the solid, practical things. She thought about what she was going to say when she got there. She thought about what she'd been looking for when she answered that first letter from a stranger in a valley town 2 years ago, after her father died, and the house felt too big and too quiet, and Millhaven felt like a life that had been fitted to someone else. She had been looking for something she couldn't name then. She was starting to be able to name it now. It wasn't security. It wasn't companionship. It was the feeling of being fully seen by someone who had chosen, deliberately, at a cost, to look. They set out for Dellridge the next morning with the wagon rolling smooth on its repaired wheel, and the sky overhead pale and wide and full of the particular silence that follows storms. Eli rode alongside on his gray horse, which he called Nothing. She'd asked the horse's name the day before, and he'd looked at her like the question surprised him, and then said, "Don't have one." She'd named it something immediately, Birch, because of the patches on its coat, and the horse had turned its head to look at her when she said it, which she took as confirmation. Eli had said nothing, but she saw the side of his mouth shift. They made good progress on the first day. The road was soft but passable. The mountains fell away behind them slowly, the way big things retreat, not all at once, but incrementally, the peaks shrinking by degrees until they were just a gray suggestion against the northern sky. She told him about Millhaven, about her father hammering at the forge in the mornings when the air was still cold enough to see your breath, and how the sound of it was the first thing she heard every day growing up. That steady, ringing note that meant the world was beginning again, that someone reliable was already at work. She told him about her mother's garden, not flowers, never flowers. Her mother had no patience for things you couldn't eat. And how every summer, the whole back half of their property became a small kingdom of green and growing. She told him about the neighbor boys who'd courted her with varying degrees of commitment, and how none of it had ever felt right. Not wrong exactly, just off. Like wearing someone else's coat. It fit, but it wasn't yours. Eli listened to all of it. She was starting to understand that he was a man who listened with his whole self, not waiting for his turn to speak, actually listening. On the second evening of travel, they passed through a small settlement called Bracton, a cluster of weathered buildings, a water trough, a trading post with a crooked sign. Eli went in for supplies, while she watered the wagon horse. She was standing by the trough when a man she didn't know stepped off the trading post porch and stopped when he saw Eli coming out of the door. The air changed. She felt it. The man was older, heavy-set, wearing a long duster. He looked at Eli with something that was beyond contempt. "Boss," he said, "didn't expect to see you down from your mountain." Eli said nothing, didn't stop walking. The man stepped sideways, blocking the path slightly. "You know they still talk about Sanderson Creek," the man said. "What you did, what you didn't do." Eli stopped, looked at the man with those pale, steady eyes, said nothing for a long 5 seconds. Then he went around him. Clara watched from the trough. The man watched Eli go. Then he looked at her. Something in her expression must have told him something, because he looked away first and went back inside. She waited until they were a mile out of Bracton before asking. "Sanderson Creek," she said. It wasn't a question exactly. He rode beside her in silence for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "7 men," he said. "We were pinned down in a canyon 2 days east of here. Ambush. I had to choose who to pull out first." He stopped. She waited. "I chose wrong," he said. "Man I left, Cotter, he didn't make it." He said this without flinching, but without distance either. He didn't package it, didn't explain it away, just set it down between them, plain and solid, like a stone. "The others lived?" she asked. "6 of them," he said. "Because of you," she said. He shook his head slowly. "Because of choices I made before I had the right information. The 6 weren't my doing. Cotter was." She sat with that for a while. The hardest kind of math. The kind where the right answer still breaks something in you. "You carry all of it," she said. Not a question this time either. He looked at the road ahead. "Someone has to," he said. She thought of the small carved bird on the leather cord. She thought of 6 men alive in the world who didn't know they owed their lives to a choice made in a canyon by a man who had never forgiven himself for the man he didn't save. She thought of Cotter, whoever he was. She thought about what it cost to be a person who carried everything, the living and the dead both, and kept walking. By the time they made camp that night, she had stopped thinking about Dellridge. She was thinking about the man beside the fire, the man who carried his daughter's carved bird against his chest and couldn't name his own horse, and had walked into a killing river because someone on the far bank needed help. She was thinking about what it would mean to know someone like that, what it would mean to be known by someone like that. She was thinking about a lot of things she probably shouldn't have been thinking about 4 days from Dellridge. She asked him the question on the 3rd night of travel, sitting beside the fire after supper with the sound of crickets filling the dark around them and the stars doing what stars always did in open country, covering everything. She'd been building toward it for 2 days. She'd felt it sitting under every conversation, under every mile of road, waiting. She asked it plain, "Do you ever think about coming back down? For good. Not to the valley, not to anywhere specific. Just down. Among people." He was poking at the fire with a long stick, sending small sparks up into the dark. He kept doing that for a while after she asked. Like the fire needed more attention than it did. "I think about it," he said finally. "And?" she said. He looked at her across the fire, those pale eyes in firelight. "And it seems like something that would require a reason," he said. She held his gaze. He held hers. Neither of them said anything for a long time. She had found the wildflowers that morning. They were laid beside her bedroll when she woke. 3 small bunches of late-season mountain flowers, purple and yellow, arranged not casually, but with a kind of quiet care. He was already saddling Birch when she came out of the wagon. He didn't mention the flowers. She didn't either. But she'd picked them up and held them all morning, and that evening she pressed 2 of them carefully between the pages of her ledger. And she was aware, doing it, that she was making a decision she hadn't fully named yet. She was preserving something. You only preserved things you planned to keep. Gerald Fenn. She thought about him by name, deliberately, the way you think about something you've been avoiding. She took his letters out of the satchel that night and read through them by firelight while Eli slept. They were good letters. They were kind and honest and careful. He described wanting a partner, described the valley as something to be shared, not just owned. He was not a bad man. She was increasingly certain of that. She was also increasingly certain of something else. That she had written back to those letters because they were safe. Because they offered a life that was predictable and decent and would not require her to be afraid. She had been afraid her whole adult life of being alone, of being wrong, of choosing badly and having to live with it. Gerald Fenn's letters had felt like a door that couldn't blow shut. She had walked toward it with relief. She was not sure anymore that relief was the right reason to walk through a door. She asked Eli the next morning, on the road, about what he thought made a good marriage. It was a forward question, and an almost reckless one. She asked it anyway. He was quiet for a good while, then said, "Nora and I used to disagree about almost everything. Which route to take, when to plant, whether the cat was allowed in the house." He paused. The cat. She filed that away. They'd had a cat. "We disagreed about most things," he said, "but we always agreed about what mattered." She asked what mattered. "Whether you were willing to be honest, even when it was going to cost you," he said. "Whether you chose the other person again, every day, even on the days when choosing them was hard." He stopped talking and looked at the road ahead. She looked at it too. The valley was visible now, a long green floor between the mountains with the shapes of buildings in the distance. Dellridge, half a day's ride. She stopped the wagon at a rise that overlooked the valley and sat for a long time without speaking. Below them, the town was small and neat and real. Gerald Fenn was down there somewhere, probably looking out his window at this same road, probably wondering if she was coming. He'd been waiting a long time. He deserved an answer. She was just no longer sure what the answer was. She heard Eli pull Birch up beside the wagon. He looked at the valley too. Neither of them spoke. Then he said very quietly, "You still want to go down?" She turned to look at him. His face was still. No push in it. No pull. Just the question offered clean and plain, with the answer entirely hers to make. She looked at the valley. She looked at him. She looked at the road in both directions, one road going down, one road going back north toward the mountains. She had never felt so completely like herself as she felt right now, on this rise, with this choice open in front of her, like a river she had to cross. And she thought, I've crossed worse. They rode down into Dellridge in the early afternoon, the town coming into focus slowly. The main street, the livery, the general store, the white-painted church, with its small square bell tower. It was a real town, more substantial than she'd imagined from the letters. 2-story buildings, a school she could see at the far end. Children running in the yard behind it, their voices carrying on the flat valley air. She felt something complicated settle over her. This was a good place. Decent. Established. The kind of place where a woman could build a real life and not be wrong about it. She had known that from the letters. It was somehow both easier and harder to see it with her own eyes. Gerald Fenn met them on the main street. He must have been watching from the window of the dry goods store, his store, she realized, the name Fenn painted above the door in careful letters. He came out when the wagon rolled up, and she knew him immediately, from the description in his letters and from something about the way he moved. Careful and deliberate. A man who did nothing without thought. He was around 40, lean, with a kind, intelligent face and the beginning of gray in his beard. He looked at her the way she'd hoped he would, openly, warmly, without property in it. "Miss Winslow," he said, "you made it." "I did," she said. There was an awkward pause, the pause of two people whose letters have been intimate and whose faces are still new to each other. She introduced Eli as the man who'd helped her cross the swollen river and repaired her wheel. Gerald extended his hand. Eli shook it. Something moved between the three of them in that moment. Something subtle and enormous. Clara felt it. She was fairly certain all three of them did. Gerald gave her a room at the Widow Parsons' boarding house, 2 doors down from the church. He gave Eli a spot in the livery and supper at his own table that evening, which was the correct thing to do, and which Eli accepted with the same plain courtesy he accepted everything. Supper was at Gerald's house. A proper house, solid and warm, with good furniture and a kitchen that smelled like it had been used for years by someone who cared about the work. They ate together, the three of them, and the conversation was careful and polite and about everything except what it was about. Gerald was gracious. Eli was quiet. Clara sat between them and felt like a river with 2 banks. After supper, Gerald walked her back to the boarding house. It was a short walk, barely 100 yards. He didn't try to hold her hand or say anything too large for the moment. He was a man of appropriate scale. She liked that about him. At the door, he stopped and looked at her with those honest, intelligent eyes and said, "I want you to know, there's no pressure here. I meant what I said in the letters. I want a partner who chooses this freely." She looked at him. She thought about the letters, all those careful, precise, good letters. She thought about 6 months of words between 2 people building something together, piece by piece, in the way that words can build. "I know you did," she said. "I just need a day or 2. He nodded, said of course, said he'd be right here. She believed him. She went inside. She sat by the window of her small room at the boarding house for a long time that night. The street below was quiet. She could see the livery from her window. She could see a light on inside. She thought about what she'd told herself when she'd started writing to Gerald Fenn. She thought about what she'd told herself every time she'd been afraid of the wrong choice. She thought about her father hammering at the forge. that steady, ringing note that meant someone reliable was already at work. She thought about small carved birds on leather cords. She thought about rivers and what it took to cross them, and the particular look of a man who has decided, without hesitation, without negotiation, without anything except the raw fact of seeing someone who needed help, to go. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew sitting there in the quiet of that room that she was done choosing safety over truth. Whatever she decided, it would be the honest choice, even if it cost her. Eli was saddling Birch when she found him. First light, the livery smell of hay and horses and cold morning air. He had his pack loaded, his bedroll tied, and he was working the saddle buckle with those large, steady hands when she stepped through the door. He looked up. Something crossed his face. Something she was learning to read, these small weathers that moved through his expression and were gone before most people would have seen them. But she saw it. She'd been watching his face for 5 days, and she saw it. She said his name. He went back to the saddle buckle. Was going to leave before it got complicated, he said. It already is complicated, she said. He didn't argue with that. She walked to Birch's head and put her hand on the horse's neck and stood there. The horse turned and looked at her the way Birch always did, with that particular calm intelligence that she'd decided was the horse's best quality. Gerald is a good man, Eli said. He wasn't looking at her. He was checking the cinch strap. He is, she said. Then you should... Don't, she said. Quiet, firm. He stopped, looked at her. She met his eyes across the horse's back. Don't tell me what I should do, she said. You've done a lot of things for me in the last 5 days. That's not one of them. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he let out a slow breath and looked at the saddle and said nothing. She came around the horse and stood closer than she needed to. Not threatening, just close. She said, I know what I saw in the water. He stiffened, barely, just the slightest tightening through his shoulders. I don't know what you... Nora, she said. And Wren. He was very still. I know you carry them with you, she said. I know that's not going to stop. I'm not asking it to. He turned and looked at her fully then. Something had broken open in his face. Not broken badly. Broken the way ice breaks in spring, letting something through. She'd never seen him look like this. Unguarded. Raw. He looked younger and older at the same time. Like someone standing in a doorway, not sure which direction was forward. Clara, he said. Her name in his voice. First time he'd used it like that, not as a label, but as something he'd thought about. She felt it land. I've been up on that mountain for 2 winters, he said. I don't know if I remember how to... You fixed my wagon, she said. You learned me in 5 days better than most people have in years. You laid flowers by my bedroll and thought I wouldn't notice. He looked away. She stepped closer. I'm not asking you to forget them, she said. I would never ask that. I'm asking if you're willing to also, still, be here. He didn't answer right away. He was quiet for so long the morning birds outside started, and the light through the livery cracks went from gray to pale gold. She waited. She had learned in 5 days that his silences were never empty. He was working something through, the way he worked rivers, reading it, understanding it, finding the angle. Finally, he said, I've been afraid of this since the first night. She almost smiled. Fear and action aren't the same thing, she said. You can be afraid and still go. He looked at her. the ghost of his own words. Then, slowly, fully, unmistakably, he smiled. Not almost, all the way. It transformed his face. She had been right to store the other ones, the near smiles, as currency. This one was worth everything she'd saved. She went to Gerald that morning. She went directly, before she could tell herself to wait. He was already at the store, opening up, turning the sign in the window. He looked at her face when she came up the steps, and she saw the moment he understood. He went very still. Then he let out a slow breath and looked at the street. She stood beside him. She said she was sorry. She said she had come here in good faith and believed it right up until she believed something else. She said she knew this was not what he'd waited for. He was quiet for a while. Then he said something she hadn't expected. I could tell. The way you looked at him when you introduced us. I could tell. He wasn't cruel about it. He wasn't cold. He was honest. The way his letters had always been honest. And it cost him something to be honest right now. And he paid the cost without complaint. She felt a profound respect for him. She told him so. He nodded slowly, looked at the street and said, "Go," before he convinces himself he doesn't deserve it. She walked back to the livery with the morning sun on her shoulders and her whole chest feeling like something that had been clenched for years had finally let go. Eli was still there. Birch was still saddled. But he was sitting on the fence rail outside the livery door, not moving, not going anywhere. Like he'd made a decision of his own in the last hour and was waiting to see if it was the right one. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her. She looked at him. The whole 5 days were in that look. The river, the fire, the flowers, the photograph, the carved bird, the road, the valley. The name he'd said like a prayer. "Gerald," he said. "He's a good man," she said. "He told me to come back before you convinced yourself you didn't deserve it." Something moved through Eli's face. He looked down at the ground for a moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were bright in a way she hadn't seen before. Not tears exactly. Just light. Just the look of someone who has been carrying a door and finally found somewhere to set it down. They didn't stay in Dellridge. There was nothing for them there. Not in a way that was unkind to anyone. Gerald had built something solid and real, and he would find what he was looking for. She believed that absolutely. But the valley was his. The mountains were what she and Eli both knew now. What they both kept turning back toward in their thoughts. They stayed 2 days. She bought supplies at Gerald's store. He charged her fair prices and shook Eli's hand without coldness, and she loved him a little for both of those things. She wrote her mother a letter, 2 pages, explaining as much as she could explain. She sealed it and sent it on the eastbound rider and let it go. The ride back north was different. The same road, the same mountains growing back into the sky ahead of them. But different in the way everything is different when you've stopped pretending it's temporary. They talked more and less. Both things felt right. He told her about the cabin. 1 room, well-built, solid chimney, enough space for 2. He described it the same way he described the valley that first day on the ridge, like something showing off. She listened and felt the picture build in her mind. A real room, a real fire. The mountain looking over it, like a familiar face. She thought about her father's forge, about the steady ringing note that meant someone reliable was already at work. She thought she might build something like that here, a sound that meant the world was beginning again. They came to the river on the 4th day of the return trip. It was almost back to what it must have been before the storm, narrow, brisk, clear. Barely knee-deep at the crossing point. She looked at it and remembered the first time she'd stood on this bank. The roaring brown wall of it, the shape on the far bank, the man folding his coat. She looked at Eli beside her now. He was looking at the river too, reading it the way he read all water, old habit, old skill. He glanced at her. She glanced at him. "I don't think you need to carry me this time," she said. He said, "No." She said, "You could hold my hand." He looked at the river for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, his hand large and scarred and steady. She held it. They crossed together. She didn't look at the water. That evening, in the high camp below the mountain, with a fire going and the smell of pine and cold air around them, and the stars beginning overhead, she asked him something she'd been holding since the very first night. She asked what he'd thought, really thought, when he'd seen her on the far bank. Before he went in, that long moment of stillness on the far bank when she'd waved, and he'd just stood there. He was quiet for a while. The fire crackled. The mountains kept their dark counsel. Then he said, "I thought, there's someone who isn't ready to give up yet." She felt that move through her like water, like warmth, like the ringing of a hammer on iron in the cold morning air. She looked at the fire and thought about giving up and not giving up and all the rivers between the two. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took out the 2 pressed flowers she'd saved from the morning he'd laid them by her bedroll. She held them in her palm in the firelight, small and dried and still faintly colored. He looked at them. He looked at her. "I didn't think you noticed," he said. "I noticed everything," she said. And the mountains were quiet, and the fire was warm, and somewhere above them, on a hillside she hadn't seen yet, 2 small graves were not forgotten. They were folded into this, into the fire and the hand-holding and the choice to cross again. Some rivers you survive once, and some you cross again and again, and the crossing is the living. This was the living. This was the whole of it. And it was enough, and it was real. And it was theirs. If this story moved you, share it. Like, subscribe, and drop your country and time in the comments below.